Welcome, everybody, to the latest episode of The American Founding, a podcast about early American history, political philosophy, and the United States Constitution. The American Founding is sponsored by the Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College. And I want to take a moment here and just tell you a little bit about Grove City. It ranks among the best colleges in both Pennsylvania and the United States. It fosters intellectual, moral, spiritual, and social development consistent with a Christian worldview. And it advocates individual freedom and personal responsibility, seeking to preserve America's political, economic, and religious heritage. It is also one of the few truly independent colleges in the nation. It accepts no federal funding whatsoever, including federal student aid. That enables it to operate free of government interference or political influence, and you can learn more at faithandfreedom.com. Well, welcome back to the podcast. Took last week off, just a busy schedule of events. The previous episode, we had talked about the Electoral College. And just as a reminder, what we'd been talking about when we discussed the Electoral College was this idea that the president had to have some sort of independence from Congress. That if he was going to be a check upon Congress, then he'd have to be independent of it. And the need for independence led to a variety of other downstream problems that ultimately resulted in the creation of the Electoral College, much of which has been abandoned. We still have aspects of the Electoral College that we make use of, for instance, the apportionment of electoral votes, but the original founding vision hasn't really been in play since the 1790s. So that issue of the Electoral College sort of leads us to the broader question of checks and balances, as well as separation of powers, which is going to be the subject this week. And the issue of the independence of the president from Congress sort of speaks to this. The framers wanted the president to be an independent check on Congress, which meant that he had to have a separate source of political power than Congress. He couldn't be chosen by Congress, had to be separated from Congress. So the question is why? Why did the framers seek this separation between the president and the executive branch? And to a lesser extent, the courts, although the courts are not going to feature terribly large in this current discussion. We'll talk about the courts more in a subsequent lecture or a subsequent episode. So why are checks and balances important, and how do they relate to the issue of separation of powers? So James Madison talks a lot about this in Federalist 51. Federalist 51 is the sort of classic American treatise on the logic of checks and balances. And I want to sort of put that essay in context for us this week and think about things from the big picture. And the big picture is the problem of the corruption of government. And by that, I do not simply mean, kickbacks and things like that. I mean it on a more fundamental, existential, even ontological level, where the power and purpose of government is used for private ends rather than public ends. This is a problem that has deep roots in Western political tradition. It was something that the ancients understood as well. We're going to talk about them this week. And the way to think about this is a republic, as we understand it, is a form of government not only where the people rule, but also where the people rule for the good of the entire community. So what happens if the people rule, but the rule of the people is unjust, or the rule of the people is dedicated to the enrichment of those who happen to be in a majority? In that case, it would not be a republic. We might call it mob rule. This is part of a general problem with really any type of government. So you can imagine a monarchy is a rule of one. What happens when the king or the queen, the sovereign, rules not for the good of the political community, but for the enrichment of themselves? Well, as Jefferson points out in the Declaration of Independence, that's where you get a despotism. You can also sort of think about an aristocracy where is supposed to be the rule of the wise, but if that becomes corrupt, it is known as an oligarchy, the rule of the rich. So in other words, it's not just a question of who rules, but for what purpose do they rule? If the rule is for the purpose of the entire community, that would be a good form of government. If the rule is for the enrichment of the rulers, that would be a bad form of government. And the ancients understood this problem. As a matter of fact, the ancients even believed that there was a sort of government as a tragic cycle. One of the classic theorists of this is a historian by the name of Polybius, who articulated and expounded upon what has since become known as the anacyclosis. Polybius sort of creates a highly stylized cycle of governments that birth to zenith and then ultimately to corruption. So, for instance, in the anacyclosis of Polybius, you have a monarch, a good king, a good sovereign, who governs for the sake of the entire community. And maybe he has a son who does likewise, but sooner or later there's an heir to the throne, king or queen, who rules only for themselves. And that's where government devolves into a despotism. And again, this is a highly stylized historical sort of way of thinking about things, but in the stylistic narrative that Polybius sketches, that would be a circumstance in which the elites, the political elites, would overthrow the sovereign and rule as an aristocracy, or the rule of the wise. But again, sooner or later, this will be corrupted into an oligarchy and then is replaced in Polybius' styling the rule of the people in a republic, but that also is eventually corrupted and becomes the situation of mob rule. All right, finally, you devolve into chaos, and then you get a strong man to take over, and the cycle begins again. All right, this was sort of like what Polybius sketched out as a kind of an inevitable cycle of history. And it relates to more modern views of the problems of government, because the problem here is ultimately one of human selfishness. I mean, that's what the ancients are getting at. I mean, this is the problem of all government, is how do you ensure that the people in whom you've entrusted the power of government actually use that power for the good of the entire community, especially in the face of the inevitable tendency of human selfishness. So what do you do about this? Well, there's several theories. We've already discussed about some of them, and we're gonna bring some of these back into the mix here later on. But we have one such theory is the medieval notion of mixed estates, where you have the landed aristocracy and the middling landowners governing with the church and with the king. Obviously, we talked about this before, that's not going to be adopted in the United States of America. Instead, the United States adopts this idea of a large republic, which is a vision of a diverse political community with a variety of interests that create balance amongst themselves without artificially empowering, aristocrats or anything like that. That is the vision in Federalist 10. Right? That's Madison's vision of how do we solve the problem of majority factions, or in other words, how do we keep the government from ruling for the sake of the people who happen to be in a majority, make it so that majorities are always in flux, and so no single faction ever gets in control. All right. So there's a related sort of, when you think about the organization of the state, there's a related sort of set of ideas here, which is, okay, who is going to be in charge and what's it going to look like? Madison's argument was that a large republic could sort of help break this tragic cycle that Polybius sketches out. But there's other ideas that the framers are making use of and that they're drawing upon, and that is where we're going to get to checks and balances. One of the premier ideas comes from Montesquieu, who we talked about in the past. He's an 18th century French sociologist / historian / philosopher who argues in his famous and very sprawling work, The Spirit of the Laws, that separation of powers between the executive, the legislative, and the judicial functions is essential for the preservation of freedom. So the idea that the lawmaker has to be different than the enforcer of the law and also the person adjudicating the law. And Montesquieu argues that, at least in theory, the British have this at the core of their system. So the spirit of the British system is liberty. Right? The idea is when you think about the government as an entity, the government is the entity that has a monopoly on force, and that force can manifest itself in three aspects: the power to write the law, the power to enforce the law, and the power to resolve disputes arising under the law. So Montesquieu's great insight is to protect liberty You need to make sure you have different agents doing all three of these. So the Americans, in the main, adopt this basic principle. And so you can see at the beginning of Article 1, it very clearly states that the legislative power is invested in a Congress of the United States. At the beginning of Article 2, the executive power is invested in the President of the United States. And then in Article 3, the judicial power is invested in the Supreme Court of the United States. So our three branches of government mimic this Montesquieu vision of the separation of powers. However, the Americans take this idea and expand upon it. And to do so, they rely very heavily on the traditions of the Roman Republic. And it is from this Roman understanding that you begin to see an articulation of checks and balances. So, what are we talking about when we're talking about the Roman Republic? Well, according to tradition, and it's the traditional history of Rome as it comes down from the ancients. So this would be different than, say, if you're reading like Mary Beard, okay, like a modern historian. If you're reading traditional historians like Livy, it's their view of history is very stylized and sometimes a mix of fact and fiction and mythology. It gets mixed in there. So when I say according to tradition, that's what I mean, the traditions that come down through the classic Roman historians. So according to this tradition, the Romans overthrew their king in 506 BC. And then in fits and starts over the next 300 years, they developed a system of government into what became known as the Republic. And it is Polybius who does a really interesting service for us in documenting in the histories his view of this republic. And there's a couple reasons Polybius is important. For one reason is that Polybius is writing in the 2nd century BC. So this is really before the republic becomes corrupted, right? So you can sort of beginning the process of the corruption of the Roman Republic, you can sort of date it around the rise of the Gracchi brothers, and then sort of culminating in Caesar's taking over, right? So this long sort of 100-year period of corruption. Polybius predates that. So he's sort of writing and looking at the Roman Republic kind of at its zenith. Another advantage that Polybius offers us as an analyst of the Roman system is that he's actually Greek by birth. Polybius was brought to Rome, as many Greeks were. He was brought to Rome as a slave, and he ends up in Rome. And he has this Greek education. I think he's a tutor. That's often what happened. The Romans would enslave Greeks and then bring them back, and they would have them educate their children in how to speak Greek because the Romans were obsessed with the Greeks. So Polybius is writing and analyzing the Roman system through the lens of Greek political philosophy. And in his histories, he praises the Romans for blending the rule of the one, the rule of the few, and the rule of the many. Okay, so the rule of the one is through the Roman consulship, the rule of the few is the Senate, and the rule of the many is the Roman assembly. And Polybius's argument is that the defects of each system of government, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, are sort of checked and balanced by the others. Okay, that's sort of Polybius's idea. And his basic intuition is that the Senate can stop the excesses of the consulship, and likewise the assembly, that they all can sort of have the ability to stop one another from violating the Constitution. Now, to be sure, Polybius's account was highly stylized. And as a matter of fact, as far as I know, I'm not an expert on Roman history, but as far as I know, the precise details of how the Roman government actually worked they're sketchy. We have broad brushstrokes, but specific things are often just been lost to history. And Polybius's account is, unfortunately, it's very stylized. He in a lot of ways, he sort of even though his analysis is very astute, he's sort of trying to almost kind of bang a square peg into a round hole here, because, like, for instance, there are two consuls, right? So when he says the consuls are the rule of the one, well, there's actually two consuls. On top of that, there's dozens of lower elected officials in the Roman system. There's praetors, there's all sorts of offices that have their own executive power. So there's really no rule of the one. And any Roman citizen had the right to vote in the assembly, but the system privileges wealthy, it privileges older Romans, it privileges people who live in the city itself. So it's hardly the rule of the many. Okay. However, even though Polybius is sort of straining to make the Roman Republic fit this classical Greek typology of the rule of the one, the few, and the many, he still is capturing this genius of the Roman system, which is its establishment of elaborate networks of power sharing among the elites. And he's on to something, at least as far as the framers are concerned, he's on to something, and how this power sharing had enabled the Romans to prevent degeneration of their system into tyranny. Because any elite or group of elites that tried to seize power for themselves, they could be met with a swift response for other elites. Now, ultimately, this system ends up falling apart in no small measure because the demands of the empire lead to the creation of these large professional armies that become loyal to their generals. So you get guys like Pompey the Great, and you get guys like Crassus, and ultimately Julius Caesar. So the system itself is not well suited to an imperial Rome. However, nevertheless, this idea, the Roman idea, looms large in the American imagination in many, many ways. Washington, for instance, modeled his behavior on Cincinnatus, who is, again, according to the traditional narrative, he's the Roman general who took command as a dictator when the Republic was in danger, but he gave it up when peace had been secured. Hamilton and Madison, in the Federalist Papers, used the pseudonym Publius, which is a name in honor of Publius Valerius Publicola, who helped overthrow the monarchy. Even the Anti-Federalists using the name Brutus. Brutus is also one of the individuals who overthrew the original Etruscan monarchy, supposedly murdered the Etruscan king. I think it was Tarquin VI or something like that. And then, of course, murdered Julius Caesar. All right, so the defender of the Republic. The United States Capitol, it's always a little weird. The city where the government is located is Capitol with an A, but Capitol Hill is Capitol with an O. And the reason for that is that I think it was Jefferson who had the United States Capitol named after the Capitoline Hill in Rome. Rome famously has 7 hills. The Capitoline Hill was where I believe the temple to Jupiter was erected, so it was the big place, right? And of course, the Senate is named after the Roman Senate. And so what the founders do then is they take Montesquieu's idea of separation of powers with the Roman notion of power sharing. So what you get then is that the legislative, executive, and judicial branches are largely in control of their own powers, but at the margins, the authority is blended. And so that way, Madison puts this, is that all business liable to abuses, this is Madison, would, quote, pass through separate hands, the one being a check on the other. And we'll talk more about this in detail, but later on, when we go over the detail, I want you to pay special note that they were especially sensitive to power sharing when it came to the war-making power and the peacemaking power. And the major concern of the framers was the historic abuse of the war-making power had been in medieval Europe and early modern Europe. War, the decisions about war and peace had been largely left to the sovereign, the king, the queen. And so a lot of times wars would be fought not for the good of the community, but for the glory of the king. So maybe the best English example of this would be the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War happens because the King of France dies, and Edward III is the grandson of the King of France, and he claims his right to rule, and the French deny that because his claim comes through the maternal line. Comes through the late king's daughter, and so that's considered illegitimate. Anyway, as a consequence of this, England and France are at war for, actually, it works out to be like 118 years or something. So the importance of power sharing on the war powers, very, very important. So to appreciate just how the extent to which the framers are reliant upon the Greeks here, I want to quote for you Polybius in his histories, and then I'm going to give you a quote from Madison in Federalist 51, and I want you to appreciate the really striking overlap between these two ideas. This is Polybius. When any one of the three classes, now remember, when Polybius is talking of the three classes, he's talking about the consulship, he's talking about the Senate, and he's talking about the assembly, the one, the few, the many. When any of the three classes become puffed up and manifest an inclination to be contentious and unduly encroaching, the mutual interdependency of all three and the possibility the pretensions of any one being checked and thwarted by the others must plainly check this tendency, and so the proper equilibrium is maintained by the impulsiveness of the one part being checked by its fear of the other. So what's Polybius getting at here? Well, we see this directly in Madison. Madison, quote, "The great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachment of the others. The provision for defense must in this, as in all cases, be made commensurate to the degree of the attack. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place." So this is a great example of what Madison and Hamilton would call the science of politics, in which they're using the wisdom of history to design a government, to govern men not as we would like human beings to be. It would be wonderful and fantastic and great if human beings were capable of self-sacrifice and virtue in a reliable fashion, but that is not true. So what we have to do in this sort of scientific understanding is we have to figure out a way, as Madison put it, to make ambition counteract ambition. Right? We need people to stop encroachments of power in the government, not necessarily because they're bad for the community, but because they're bad for the other people in the government. That's the idea. And Polybius's point is that the Romans had managed to do this, that the Romans had set up a system in which the ambition of Roman political elites, which was, as impressive. Roman political elites were highly ambitious. But by establishing a system in which they were forced to share power, the best way for them to slake their thirst for glory was to work together. Okay, and that's sort of the idea behind checks and balances. Checks and balances sitting as a modification of the idea of separation of powers. So the way that this helps avoid what Polybius called the anacyclosis, or this tragic cycle of good governments being created and then hitting an apogee and then decaying. Right? What's going on here is it's important to put this in the broader perspective. The idea of separating power and the idea of checking and balance power within the government, that is not controlling the people. It really doesn't. When we're talking about checks and balances, we're talking predominantly about political elites. Because at the end of the day, if there is a majority faction that exists in the government, in the political community, and is large enough, it's going to get what it wants. In other words, checks and balances is not going to stop the people from ruining the government if the people are intent on this. Right? This is why Madison calls the system of checks and balances in Federalist 51, he calls it an auxiliary precaution. As a matter of fact, if you read Federalist 51, Madison, as he's concluding, says, well, what's the great ultimate security? The great ultimate security is the extended republic. That is going to be what keeps the people in line. This system of checks and balances is really kind of more of a way to keep the elites in line. I mean, it's definitely a way to tamp down on temporary flights of public fancy, right? That show up maybe in the House but get checked by the other branches. But the way to think about checks and balances is, as well, for that matter, as the separation of powers, is I would probably draw upon modern rational choice theory. And this is a language that Madison wouldn't use, but it's a logic that he would be familiar with, and that's the principal agent problem, which is a game theoretic problem that exists in rational choice theory. Principal agent problem works like this: how does a principal make sure that his agent is actually doing what he wants rather than what the agent wants? That's a common problem. That's a problem, and like, you can appreciate this like when you actually hire an agent, like a real estate agent. The solution is that the agent gets a percentage of the sale price, right? So that creates an incentive for the agent to do everything that is good for you, right? That's typically how an agent works in the free market, but we're not talking about the free market here. We're talking about government. So in this case, the principal is the voter, and the agent is the politician or their elected representative, whoever holds power in trust for the people. Okay, so the question then is, in that situation, how do we make sure that the agents are not actually abusing their power for their own good? And Polybius, by his study of Rome, and then Madison explicitly in Federalist 51, make the argument that one way to do that is to make sure that there are multiple agents within the government, each of which are dependent upon the others. And so that way, if any one of them becomes too puffed up, as Polybius put it, they get knocked back down by the others in government. So this is a way to keep the elites. This is a way to keep the elites in line. Okay. Again, just to reiterate, if the public at large is possessed of a factional desire that runs contrary to the demands of justice, if they really are insistent upon this, checks and balances is not going to solve the problem permanently. This, again, Madison only calls this an auxiliary precaution. It's a very important one. It's very important to understand the structure of the government. But remember, because this is a republic, ultimately the people decide. And if the people really want something, checks and balances at most is only going to create a break. So how does this work in practice? How do checks and balances work in practice? What institutions within the Constitution are sort of part of checks and balances? Well, for starters, we get two chambers of Congress. So bicameralism. The two chambers are completely independent of each other, including in their rules, and both chambers have complete authority over their members. Both chambers are elected in different manners, different times, and for them to write a law, they must agree. Okay. Now, we've changed this a little bit because originally, in the original founding, the Senate was chosen by state governments and the people choose the House. Now the people choose both, but nevertheless, the time frame of both choices is different, and also there's difference in the constituencies of senators and House members. Senators have larger constituencies than House members, so they're different in that way. You can appreciate this another way. Constitutional amendments require, typically, as it has historically been done, constitutional amendments require the approval of Congress and the state governments. So that's an example of checks and balances. No single branch is capable of changing the Constitution all by themselves. Also, the president is able to veto congressional laws, but Congress can override if 2/3 of both branches agree. Another example is that presidents, executive officials, and judges can be impeached by the House, but they have to be convicted by the Senate. So that's another example as well. And I mentioned a moment ago the power, well, before I get to the war-making power, let's talk about the peacemaking power, the treaty-making power. The power to negotiate treaties is reserved to the executive branch. But before the treaties take the force of law, the Senate has to ratify them. Okay. That's a big deal too. Okay. And so let's think about the war-making power. Congress has the power to declare war. Congress alone has the power to declare war. Congress has the power to finance wars. Specifically, Congress has the power to raise taxes, and Congress has the power to appropriate money for the Army. And by the way, appropriations for the Army can only last for 2 years. That's in the Constitution as well. So Congress, for the military to be kept up, Congress has to actively and frequently be involved. Okay. Nevertheless, the actual decisions when it comes to the waging of the war belong exclusively to the president as commander-in-chief. President is commander-in-chief. Wars are not run by committee. The president also, in his capacity as the executive, negotiates the peace, as I mentioned a moment ago. But the peace cannot finally be approved until the Senate, as a stand-in for Congress, makes the final decision. So this is how the idea of checks and balances work. Generally speaking, Congress writes the law. However, the president has the ability to give a thumbs up or thumbs down on the law. Okay? Generally speaking, the president is in charge of enforcing the law. However, Congress, if it believes that the president is failing to do so, can impeach and remove the president. Okay? Likewise, the war-making power is all kinds of tangled up, right? It's all three branches, like with the political branches, the president, the House, and the Senate, all three of them are all very closely interrelated on that as well. So this is the basic idea here, where the basic principle is that you have three branches. The executive power, the legislative, and the judicial power are mostly held in each branch, but they're blended in such a way to give the other branches the ability to stop or thwart or rebut abuses of power that are brought about by the other branches. Okay. So you'll notice what I really haven't mentioned so far are the courts. So the question often arrives in the court when it's talking about its role in the constitutional system, likes to claim that it has a role in the process of checks and balances. But arguably, it really doesn't. Now, in fairness, Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 78 does say that the courts have a final check through what today we call judicial review. However, when you look at Madison's Federalist 51, what Madison is basically doing is sketching an alternative vision of how constitutional conflicts are resolved. Hamilton in 78 basically says the court can step in, but Madison's argument in Federalist 51 is more like if one of the branches is misbehaving or acting in an unconstitutional manner, the way that gets resolved is the responses of the other branches. And something to bear in mind here when we're thinking about the role of the judiciary in the process of checks and balances, it's very important to understand that the judiciary is mostly a creation of Congress. Article 3 is a very, very short article in the Constitution. And one of the reasons for that is that Article 3 mostly kicks the problem of the courts off to Congress. Congress created the lower courts. By that I mean both the district and the appellate courts. Congress also has a decision over how many judges sit on the Supreme Court, and it also has decisions over the extent of appellate jurisdiction. So oftentimes when we think about judicial review as an institution, you could argue that it's kind of in there within the Constitution in some ways. But it's not as clear-cut as you'd think. In fact, I'd argue that judicial review is something that's really sort of crept up more over time through, like, for instance, the creation of the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights creates all of these rights that turn out to be justiciable. Right? In other words, like you can sue on the basis of your rights being violated. Well, the Bill of Rights was created after the Constitution was drafted. And frankly, Madison didn't really see the Bill of Rights as being justiciable. I mean, he didn't really think about it in that terms. He really didn't think that the Bill of Rights was going to be that kind of document. So that changes as well. And you also, with the Civil War amendments as well, one of the things that the 14th Amendment does is it obliges the state governments to follow the due process, and that by extension gives the courts authority over state governments to a greater extent than they had before the Civil War. And also, frankly, another thing as well is that in the last 150 years or so, the courts have been pretty aggressive in carving out a place for their role in judicial review on the one hand, and on the other hand, for the most part, the political branches have tolerated it. Now, that's not always true. You have seen pushback. Like, for instance, Lincoln very strongly pushes back against judicial review in 1861 in his first inaugural address. Franklin Roosevelt very aggressively pushes back on judicial review in 1937 in the court's continued sort of attack on the New Deal. You also see in the 1960s and 70s, you see this sort of movement of talk about limiting the court, frustration with the cultural liberalism of the Warren Court. So really what's had to happen over the years, I think, is that judicial review doesn't survive in the same way that, say, the veto power survives. The veto power is just in the Constitution. It belongs to the president by virtue of the Constitution. Judicial review really is a separate phenomenon that really sort of survives because the judiciary has historically been prudent in its use of it. And when the judiciary has been imprudent, you see the other branches emerge and say, oh, no, we can take this away from you. Like, this is not actually one of the checks and balances. So when we're thinking about checks and balances, judicial review, at least when we're thinking of it from a checks and balances from a Madisonian framework, judicial review is not really part of it. I mean, that's not to say that it's not a legitimate function within the government. I'm not saying that at all, although personally I'm not a big fan of judicial review. Or I should say I'm not a big fan of judicial supremacy. That's a different issue. But it is to say that when we're trying to think about checks and balances embedded within the Constitution, the power of one branch over another branch, we're really talking about the president, the House, and the Senate. This is a way to understand it. Okay, so that's going to do it for this week's episode of The American Founding. Next week, we are going to be looking at constitutional structures surrounding the concept of federalism, which is the power sharing between the states and the national government. It should be an interesting podcast. Federalism has been, since the very beginning, a source of great ambiguity, continues to be a source of ambiguity. And I think its ambiguity is probably one of the great strengths of our system of government. So I think it should be an interesting episode. I hope you tune in. And finally, before you go, if you haven't already, I ask you to consider subscribing to the podcast through your favorite streamer, be it Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, whichever one you like. And if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to review and comment on the podcast wherever you get your podcast from, that would be great. I always appreciate the feedback, and it helps boost the signal of the podcast so other people who are interested in the show can find us. So that's all I have for you this week. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a great week, and we will see you next time for federalism.